Microsoft just released a new lookup formula called XLOOKUP, and in this video I'm going to explain everything you need to know to get started with it and why it's such a cool alternative to VLOOKUP or index match. Alright, so I won't make you wait any longer. Here is the new XLOOKUP function in all of its glory. And in this video, I'm going to explain what XLOOKUP is and show some of the new features that VLOOKUP and index match don't have. I'm also going to compare XLOOKUP to both VLOOKUP and index match. I will then share some of the pros and cons of XLOOKUP. I hate to say that there are cons, but there are definitely some things that you want to be aware of that will help you prevent errors and also write the formulas faster. And then finally, I'm going to explain the general availability and what version of Excel you need to get XLOOKUP. So let's go ahead and write an XLOOKUP formula, and that'll be the easiest way to learn it. I'm going to type equals here and then X. You can also see there's a new X match function. I'll explain that in another video, but another great new function for us. So here we have XLOOKUP. So I'll just start typing XLOOKUP. You can see here that it searches a range or an array for a match and returns the corresponding item from a second range or array. And by default, an exact match is used. So let's tab into this. And here we have the arguments for XLOOKUP. Now there's 5 arguments for XLOOKUP, but only 3 of these are required. So when you first see this, it might feel a little overwhelming, but actually the first 3 are the only ones required. So the first one's going to be the lookup value. This will be similar to VLOOKUP or index match. We have our lookup value here, and then we're going to type a comma, and then of course the range we want to look in. In this case, we're only going to specify a single column, so I'll hit Control-Shift down over there to select that. Going to hit F4 on the keyboard to make that an absolute reference. Type a comma, and then the next argument is the return array. So here is the range that we want to return a value from. So in this case, I want to return the email address from the matching name. So I'm going to again select that cell, Control-Shift down arrow there, hit F4 on the keyboard to anchor that. And those are the only arguments that we need, the only required arguments. As the definition of the function stated, an exact match is the default mode here, the default match mode. So we can just close the parentheses and hit enter. That will of course look up the name in column E and return the email address from column G. And XLOOKUP works the same way VLOOKUP and match do. It's going to look down the lookup range here until it finds the lookup value, and then it's going to return a value from the return range in the same row. Now, I'm sure you're curious about those other 2 arguments, so let's check those out. I have F2 to jump into this. Put our cursor here and type a comma. We can see the next argument is match mode, and here are our options for match mode. So we have an exact match, and again, this is the default, so we don't need to specify this if we want to do an exact match. We then have -1, which will do an exact match or the next smaller item. We have 1 that will do an exact match for the next larger item, and then 2 will do a wildcard character match. So I have examples for these, and I'll show those in this video, but for now we can just specify 0 here for an exact match. Then I'm going to type a comma. And the next argument is search mode. So this allows us to specify the search order. And the default is 1 here for searching first to last. So in this case, from top to bottom. You can also specify -1 to search from last to first, which would be bottom to top. And then there's also some advanced options for binary searches. We won't necessarily focus on these in this video. Maybe we'll do a future video on that. But this would be for some more advanced use cases where performance is really important to you. So for now, we'll just specify 1, and then again, we can hit enter. That's going to return the same result because we used those default parameters or the default arguments here. And typically, if we wanted those default arguments, again, we would not need to specify those. We only need 3 arguments for XLOOKUP. So we'll now look at some additional examples of XLOOKUP and some of the cool new features. First of all, it can do a horizontal lookup as well. So in this example here, we're using XLOOKUP for a horizontal lookup. Typically, you might use HLOOKUP for this or even index match, but XLOOKUP can do this as well. So here we're just looking up this value of March in this row right here and returning the value from this row here for the matching column. So that's what we see here. We have the lookup array or that lookup row, and then the return row would be row 7. Hit enter and we'll get 1949, which is again this matching value right here. Another very cool feature of XLOOKUP is wildcard characters. So in this example here, I have a column of last names, and I want to look up these last names in column E over here. But in this case, I have the full name in column E, and then I want to return the email address. So this is absolutely possible with XLOOKUP using wildcards. So we'll jump into the formula, and for the fourth argument here, I've specified a 2. For the match mode, I've specified a 2. If you hit Alt down arrow here, you can see those options again. And again, 2 allows us to use a wildcard character match. And we do this within the lookup value. So for our lookup value, you can see I'm specifying cell B4, but I've joined that with the ampersand with the asterisk. So here in quotation marks, I have the asterisk symbol, and that's just allowing us to say any characters, any number of characters before the value of cell B4 will be part of our lookup. So we'll do a lookup for this name over here and then anything before it. And then once the XLOOKUP finds that, it will return the match, the matching row from the return array. And we could use both the asterisk and the question mark for single characters. So down here I have an example of that. And here you can see I put a question mark here for this character, the third character, because we're looking for this name here, Brianna, but maybe sometimes it's spelled with an I instead of a Y or something like that. So we want to make sure we account for both of those scenarios. And this will absolutely do that. And then my XLOOKUP function looks the same. Here we're just specifying B13, so we don't put the wildcard character in here because it's in the value over here. And then again, we have a 2 for that fourth argument for the match mode. So that's just a really brief overview of how to use wildcard characters with XLOOKUP. I'll do a whole nother video on this that explains it in more detail, but hopefully that just gives you a little taste of what's possible with XLOOKUP. Another awesome feature of XLOOKUP is the search order. So in this example, I want to answer the question, which is who made the last sale on this date? So this XLOOKUP formula is doing that. It's looking up the date in column B, and then it's returning the salesperson name. But for the fifth argument here, the search mode argument, I've specified a -1 to search from last to first. So this is going to search from bottom to top instead of top to bottom. And once it finds the first value, the exact match, because in the fourth argument here, we're specifying a 0 for exact match. So once it finds the first exact match of this date right here from the bottom going up, it's then going to return that salesperson's name right here. And then I also have a similar XLOOKUP formula to return the order ID right here using the same basic formula. And for the table row, I've used the XMatch function as well. So that's another alternative to XLOOKUP, XMatch, which is going to return the row or column number instead of the value from the cell. And again, I'll do a separate video on that, but it's kind of cool to see that one in action as well. Has the same additional arguments here for the match mode and the search mode as XLOOKUP. So let's take a look at how XLOOKUP compares to VLOOKUP and index match. Microsoft is calling XLOOKUP the replacement or predecessor to VLOOKUP and index match, so we'll see how they compare. First of all, in this example, we'll take a look at comparison to VLOOKUP, and I believe XLOOKUP has 3 main advantages over VLOOKUP. So here we have a formula, an XLOOKUP formula that's looking up this name in column F and returning the email address from column H. And that first advantage is that only 3 arguments are required. Again, we have that lookup value, lookup array, and return array. So we'll only need 3 arguments. In this cell below, I have a VLOOKUP formula that's doing the same thing, returning the same result. Again, we have our lookup value here. We have our table array, the column index number, and then we have the 4th argument, which is range lookup. Since this defaults to true, we always have to specify a false or a 0 here. So it actually requires 4 arguments, 1 additional argument over XLOOKUP. So I think that's the first win. Now the next win is inserting and deleting columns. So if I was to insert a column here before the email column, we can see now that XLOOKUP is still going to return the correct result, the email address. And that's because we've specified a separate array for the return array. Our VLOOKUP breaks in this case because we have a hard-coded 3 here for the column index number, and the third column is now the phone number instead of the email address. So we need to do something here, add an extra function like the columns function to make this more dynamic, and that just requires extra work. And so therefore the XLOOKUP wins in this case when we're inserting and deleting columns within that table array. And then finally, XLOOKUP can also look to the left. So on this sheet, we have an example of that. Now we're looking up the name in column H and returning the email address, which is in column F, which is to the left of that name. And XLOOKUP can do this because, again, it has those separate arguments for the lookup array and return array. VLOOKUP cannot do this. Yeah, you can kind of hack VLOOKUP with the choose function to make this work, but in this case you would just use index match instead, but here you don't have to. You can use XLOOKUP and keep it all in one function. And then I also wanted to point out that XLOOKUP can do closest match as well. So here's another comparison to VLOOKUP. In this case, we have a commission table here where we're looking up commission rates. XLOOKUP can do this comparison by specifying the fourth parameter, the match mode, as -1. So that's going to be an exact match or next smaller item. So this is similar to if we were to do a VLOOKUP and have the last argument as true for an approximate or closest match. So the point here is that XLOOKUP can do this as well when we're doing approximate matches. And XLOOKUP actually has an advantage here because it can do different match modes. So it can go exact match or smaller, or exact match or larger. So that means you can actually set up your lookup table here in different ways. We're currently looking up the minimum, but you could also look up the maximum as well with XLOOKUP. So now let's compare XLOOKUP and index match. In this example, I have the same formulas. Here's our XLOOKUP formula. And down here we have the index match formula. Now with a basic index match, the real advantage of XLOOKUP is just the ease of use. We only need to use one function in our formula. With index match, of course, we need to use two. When we write it, it's a little bit backwards because we have our return array first, then we have our lookup value here, and the lookup array. So XLOOKUP is just easier because it's more simplified. We just have one function. It goes in order from lookup value, lookup array, and then return array. So much easier to write. And of course, index match shares those same advantages of being able to look to the left and also inserting and deleting columns. So that's why it's better than VLOOKUP. However, XLOOKUP you could say is even better because you can do all that in one function. And then of course, XLOOKUP also has these additional arguments for the match mode, where we can look for a wildcard character, really cool feature, and the search mode where we can look in reverse order. And I should also point out that you don't have to specify the match mode. You can just leave it blank after the comma there. And then if you wanted to do a reverse order, you could do a -1 here. So this formula will still work as well, where you just have a blank for the fourth argument there, or you don't specify anything. And again, that defaults to 0 for an exact match. Okay, so now we'll take a look at some of the pros and cons of XLOOKUP. So I've mentioned a lot of the pros or advantages throughout this video. So I'll just go through these quickly. As we said, it defaults to an exact match, so we don't have to specify that last argument like we do with VLOOKUP. It only requires 3 arguments, which is great. It works both vertically and horizontally, so we don't necessarily need HLOOKUP anymore either. There's just one function instead of 2 if we were using index match. We have that fourth argument for wildcard characters, which is really cool. The fifth argument allows us to do a lookup in reverse order, which is also an awesome new feature. And then it returns a range instead of a value. That's more of an advanced thing with nested formulas. I'll cover that in a future video. So for potential cons or drawbacks, the first is that the additional optional arguments can make the function look a bit overwhelming. So as I mentioned, only the first 3 arguments are required, and then we have these 2 additional arguments that are optional. So for new users to Excel or someone that doesn't use Excel very often, this might look a little bit overwhelming. So if you're teaching XLOOKUP to your coworkers or friends, make sure that they know that only the first 3 arguments are required, and that's all they need to do an exact match lookup. Another drawback is if the lookup and return arrays are not the same length. This is probably the most common error we're going to see with XLOOKUP. So I have an example here in this sheet, and this is an XLOOKUP formula, and we can see here that the lookup array goes to row 1003, and the return array goes to row 1002. So they're not the same length here, and therefore this returns a pound value error. So this is going to happen a lot whether you're using the keyboard to select the range or the mouse. If you're using the mouse and maybe you don't go all the way to the bottom, you're going to get that error. If you're using the keyboard shortcuts and this column contains blanks, then you might have to find ways to make sure you select that entire column. So one good alternative there is to use Excel tables and reference the table column names with structured references. I'll do another video on that as well, but that would be a good way to help make sure that you don't encounter this error where the ranges are not the same length. And I'll also show how my free VLOOKUP Assistant tool can help with this as well. So another potential con is it can be time consuming to select both of those ranges. So if your formula is referencing thousands of rows, like we have in this example here, if you're using the mouse to select these ranges for the lookup array and the return array, that can be very time consuming to select those. Again, my VLOOKUP Assistant can help with that, and I'll show that in just a second. And then finally, we have to remember to make both of those lookup and return ranges absolute. If you're going to copy the formula down, again, it's that extra step of hitting F4 on the keyboard to make sure both of those ranges are absolute. So I'll just quickly show how VLOOKUP Assistant can help with this. Probably going to need to change the name at some point as XLOOKUP becomes more popular, but this is a free app that I've created, and I'm eventually going to turn it into a free add-in. Right now I just have some buttons up here that'll run some macros, and I also have a previous video that explains this in a lot more detail, but this just allows us to create formulas. So if I wanted to create an XLOOKUP formula here to return the email address, just select the cell where I want the formula to be. I'm going to click the XLOOKUP button. That's going to ask me to select the cell that contains a lookup value, also defaults to the one to the left. So we'll just hit OK. And then we're going to select a row that contains both the lookup value and the return value. Just a single row. We don't need to select everything here. So I'll just select that row, starting with the lookup value to the value we want to return. Hit OK. That's going to create the formula and insert it in the cell here. And as you can see, it's done all that work for us. So it's found the length of those based on the used range over here. It's made those absolute references as well and created the entire formula with just a few clicks. So this will make it faster and easier to write formulas and prevent errors. And again, this is a free tool. I'll put a link in the description below this video where you can download this and check this out. Also has features to convert existing VLOOKUP formulas to index match, or VLOOKUP or index match to the new XLOOKUP. And so all that can be done in one click instead of having to rewrite your formulas. And then finally on our pros and cons list are 2D lookups like index and match can do. So I'll just show a quick example of this as well. Here in this example, we have an XLOOKUP that again is looking up horizontally, but if we want to do both a horizontal and vertical lookup in the same function, XLOOKUP can't really do that by itself. You can use XLOOKUP, combine it with another XLOOKUP or some other functions to make that happen. However, VLOOKUP can do that by itself. When you put a match function in it, you nest a match function for the column index number. It's now looking up both the vertical lookup here for the region for South and also horizontally across for March to return that result. And then of course we can do that with index match as well. If we use two match functions here for both the row number and the column number, we can use index match for that to make more of an interactive model here where we can potentially make changes here or selections to see the result. So XLOOKUP's a little bit limited on that. If you want to do a setup like that, then index match is probably your best bet. And of course you can use the new XMatch function with index as well. Now, in terms of availability, you're going to need an Office 365 subscription to use XLOOKUP. Here's the help page for XLOOKUP, and you can see what versions of Excel it's available on right here. So you'll need Office 365. It'll also be on Excel for the web and the Excel web mobile apps. It will not be available on Office 2019 or any earlier versions, nor will there be any backwards compatibility. So if you're on Office 365 and you're using XLOOKUP, any users that you send your files to will also need to be on Office 365. Now, currently, XLOOKUP is only available on the Insiders Fast channel for Office 365, but it will be rolling out to the other channels in the next few months. Now, the Insiders Fast is a free program, and I'll put a link in the description below this video where you can get access to it. XLOOKUP is currently only available to a portion of those Insiders Fast users, but hopefully by the time you're watching this video, it will be rolled out to everyone on Insiders Fast. So that's an overview of the new XLOOKUP function. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you're excited about this new feature of Excel. And I now have two questions for you. The first one is, what do you think? Will this be easier to teach and explain to your coworkers, XLOOKUP instead of VLOOKUP or index match? Is this something you're excited about? And the second question is, what questions do you have about XLOOKUP? I showed some of the features like partial matches with wildcards and doing a lookup in reverse order, but there are a ton of other solutions and things we can use XLOOKUP for. So I'm just curious to know, what else do you want to use XLOOKUP for? So leave a comment below with answers to either or both of those questions. I hope you're excited about XLOOKUP, and I look forward to seeing your responses. Thanks again for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.